I'm Bill Brown. I'm the Director of Innovative Evangelism for the Baltimore-Washington Conference, as well as resourcing our siblings over in the Peninsula Delaware Conference. And I welcome you all to our Training Tuesday on Leadership Development tonight. I'm going to open us with a word of prayer, and then we'll introduce our speaker and get started. So if you all would pray with me, please. Holy and gracious God, throughout the history of the Bible, you have called people into service. And you have continually called those who everyone thought should not be called. You continually called those who felt ill-equipped and ill-prepared to serve you. And yet, oh God, you brought them out and you equipped them and you made sure that they would bear fruit. And so as we gather tonight to learn and to hear and to grow in what it means to develop and to be leaders, we just give you thanks that you have called us, God. We ask that you would help us respond to that call. I ask you to pray for my friend Ken and to bless him as he presents to us tonight. And just give us insight, wisdom, and understanding in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
As I said, we are joined by Ken Willard. He is the Director of Congregational Vitality for the West Virginia Conference. He is a professional certified coach with the International Coaches Federation. Ken has authored or co-authored 7 books. But most importantly, I love this. Ken's life mission comes from Ephesians 4, chapter 2, and he shares it as to equip God's people to expand God's kingdom. And I'm just grateful for Ken's friendship as we work together in the Northeast jurisdiction as congregational developers, and that he would take the time to be with us tonight. Just a couple of technical observations. If you have a question for our presenter tonight, I ask that you use the Q&A feature. It's a little easier for us to track and maintain. But throughout the evening, Ken may be asking you questions for a response, so our chat will be open. And so when he asks you a question, you can respond in the chat. So you might want to have that window open, but please don't ask questions in the chat. We like to keep those two things separately because the chat just moves very quickly and we don't want to miss your question. And so without further ado, on that note, Ken, let me turn it over to you. Again, thank you and welcome, and looking forward to hearing you.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks for the invitation. It's exciting to be with everyone tonight. And I'm going to spend a few minutes and I'm going to go through some of the concepts about creating a leadership pathway in your church. And hopefully you received a workbook before this webinar that you can use to maybe take notes or just to jot down ideas as you go through. If not, I encourage you to use something to capture some ideas, some notes.
I'm going to put a link. Hopefully it'll work. I'm going to put a link to the workbook, Ken, in the chat.
Good. Thank you, Bill. So I just encourage, take some notes, and I encourage you just everything we cover tonight to really put it through the filter of your ministry, the context of your ministry. So just keep thinking about, what does this look like in my particular ministry? So I'm going to share a PowerPoint as we go through, and we'll just talk through some of these concepts. So really everything that I cover tonight is based on a book that Kelly Brown and I wrote a couple of years ago called Church Ecology, Creating a Leadership Pathway for Your Church. And we are grateful to our ministry partners at Market Square Publishing for publishing the book. And we'll just talk through. Obviously, we're not going to cover everything in the book tonight, but we'll hit on some of the important concepts. And I do encourage, if you want to go deeper, hopefully that's a good resource for you to use for you and your leadership team and as you'll find out in a few minutes, especially your nominations team. So we'll talk about a few concepts as we go through. The agenda, the objectives tonight, really we're just going to review some of the concepts from the book, but we're also going to encourage you to establish at least one next step. So just because we're talking about these concepts, I encourage you not to make this just an academic exercise, to really think about, so what is it that you can actually apply in your ministry? So as we go through, we'll go through the different items, and I just encourage you, keep looking for, what is it that will work best in your context. So our spiritual formation tonight, this is the verse that Bill just shared from Ephesians 4, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, to building up the body of Christ. And for me, that really is all about equipping God's people to expand God's kingdom. Now, as a layperson, that is something that I share as my mission, and I would very strongly encourage, it's not the mission only of pastors. It's the mission of all of us who are gifted and called into ministry leadership. How do we equip ourselves and others for ministry? And that's really what this is all about tonight, is equipping ourselves and others for ministry. So the key for us in the church is our mission, and our mission is clearly shared with us. Jesus said in Matthew 28, therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. This is our mission. And one of the keys, I believe, for us as leaders in the church is to always connect leadership to discipleship. Leadership in the church flows out of discipleship. So it's not one path is one way and another path is a different way. It is beginning with discipleship, growing ourselves as disciples and equipping others to grow as disciples. That is the foundation of leadership in the church. So ecosystem, we called the book Church Ecology, and we talk about in the book an ecosystem, and it's interesting to kind of think about what is an ecosystem. And I don't know if you've ever thought about that or looked it up, but if you look it up, the definition is it's a community of living organisms in conjunction with the non-living components of the environment interacting as a system. So if you think about the church, the ministry of the church, that's a definition of the church. We have, of course, living organisms, people, working with non-living components, which could include the building, the facilities, all kinds of different non-living components, and also the environment being our community, not just the congregation. The congregation is part of that, but the bigger part of it is the environment, is the community where we're called to do ministry. So all of us interacting as a system really is the ecosystem. And it's important for us to think about our church as an ecosystem and all the different ways that implies us as leaders and us in ministry. What is it that takes us to move towards a healthier ecosystem? So when you think about health and ecosystems, there are obviously many different ecosystems around the world. On the screen are just kind of 3 examples, kind of random examples. You think about the ocean, you think about the desert, you think about maybe a rainforest. And if someone asks the question, well, which of these is healthy? Obviously, that's not a fair question because you can't measure the health of the ocean against a desert or the health of a rainforest against the ocean. They can all be healthy. They're just very different. And I share this because sometimes in churches, we have a tendency to measure a church against another church. And I just don't think that works. Churches are different. The ecosystems of every church is unique. Now, there are very good things for us to use in measurements. Measurements are great when they measure a progress towards our goal or the progress towards health or vitality or whatever word we want to use. But when we measure churches against other churches, that's not appropriate. So when we talk about ecosystems, it's not about, one is healthy and one is not. Every ecosystem can be healthy in its own way, just like every church of every size, of every type, of every, location can be healthy and vital. So as leaders in the church, it's important for us to be aware of that and to help people see that. So, like I said, the church is an ecosystem. The health of a church is measured, maintained, and improved by its leaders, the ecologists. So our role in the church as leaders, both clergy, pastors, laity, whatever our position in the church, but if we're leaders in ministry, our role is to help monitor and maintain and improve the health of the church. That's really what this is all about. How do we as leaders continue to improve the health of the organism that is the church? So we're going to talk about a lot of different areas tonight. We'll touch on all of these. Again, we don't have time to go deep into really any of these, but we're going to highlight a few as we go through. And I do want to go back to encouraging you to listen and look for what is something that really sticks out to you that you feel you can make a difference in your ministry. So prayer is the foundation for ministry. Prayer is what we build upon with everything we do within the church. Everything we do in ministry as leaders begins with prayer. So it is important for us as leaders to set that foundation. It's important for us as leaders to set the example and to understand that everything we do grows out of our prayer life. So I encourage leaders all the time. It's great to be intentional about your prayer life, to understand where you are, both individually and as a group of leaders, and look for ways to improve and strengthen that prayer life. There are many different ways we can do this. Here, some examples would be doing a prayer retreat. I know many churches will do this at least once a year with the leadership team, where they will go off for a day or so, or at least a night, and really spend time in prayer. Often, this is a lead in to some kind of either goal setting or strategic ministry planning process. So the prayer retreat is a great way to begin that. It's also a great habit to get into as a church. Encourage pastors and others in the church to pray for the leaders. Pray for the leaders in the church by name. To spend time, maybe it's one a week, to pray for the different leaders in the ministry. And I also think it's a great habit to get into of prayer walking your community. Those are all just kind of examples of different things you can do in ministry. But whatever we do in leadership and the ministry, it really needs to begin with that foundation of prayer. Now, in your workbook, there are some different questions. How is the prayer life of your church? When you think about your church, as a whole, how strong is the prayer life of your church? And whatever way you define that, think about what would it look like for the prayer life of your church to take one step, just to grow one step further this year. And I think that's a good way to view your ministry. How do we help grow that? Another thing to think about is, how would you rate the prayer life of the leaders and the key teams and communities in your church? Prayer is often something that, frankly, we pray at the beginning of a meeting, maybe at the end of a meeting, and that's it. Are we setting examples of prayer as leaders in the church? Are we stopping to pray before we make important decisions? There's lots of different ways to kind of consider this. And again, going back to what is one thing that you can do in this next season to grow the prayer life of your leaders and of your ministry, of your church. So please don't skip over this part too quickly. This is a critical element before we go any further in leadership development. So the next piece is studying the system. So if you've ever used GPS, and I use GPS every single day, I am very directionally challenged, so I get lost pretty easy. So I'm pretty much dependent on GPS. But for GPS to get me where I'm going, one of the things that I've learned living in the West Virginia mountains is, GPS needs to know where I am. So one of the first rules of leadership is to understand, where are we today? And, I think when you talk about leadership development of your church, it is important, before you plan out the future, to have a clear picture of where you are today. So I would encourage you to look at, what are you currently doing for leadership development? What are the things that the church has done in the past about developing and identifying leaders? One of the most powerful pieces for any church is the church origin story. How did leaders begin to be identified in the church? What is that history? I think mission insight, understanding the context of your mission field, is always important. But I want you to think about, how did the current leaders, when you look at your church, whatever the size, whatever the structure, the system you're using, when you identify those leaders who are currently in place, I'd encourage you to think about, so how did they get in place? What is it that was identified for us to invite them into leadership? Those are all good pieces of the puzzle. I don't think any of them stand alone, but they're all important information. And then also think about, what's important to your church right now. In the current ministry situation, what's most important right now, and what do you need to focus on in this season of ministry concerning leadership development? So I'm going to pause right there for just a second, and I encourage you, if you haven't done so already, but to really, answer a couple of those questions, especially the last one. What's most important to you right now about where your church has been and where you are now as far as leadership development? So take just a minute and jot that down. Okay, as we move forward, it's important, I think, to define what are we talking about when we use the word leader or leadership. This is a definition from the Ken Blanchard companies. And so it's not a Christian definition. It's not a church definition. but I think it's a very good definition. Leadership is the capacity to influence others by unleashing the potential and power of people and organizations for the greater good. So sometimes, in some context, the word leader is synonymous with pastor. And I think pastors can certainly, be leaders in the church. I think the position of pastor is the spiritual leader in the church. I do encourage us to be cautious that we don't only use the word leader in reference to a pastor. There are certainly laity in every church who have leadership gifts and who are called into leadership positions in ministry. So when we talk about leader and we talk about leadership, it is important, I think, for each church to take a moment and to really identify what are they talking about. Now, I'm going to get to this later, but this is another place where I will highlight, this is a great piece for the nominations team to discuss and to talk about and to explore. What are we looking for? What does it mean to be a leader in ministry? So there are many different leadership development approaches that are used by organizations, churches included, around the world. This is not meant to be an all-exclusive list, but this is some of the things that I have seen in my experience, some of the things that seem to be most often used as leadership development approaches. Excuse me. The first one is random, and this is probably the most common. This is where there are leadership development opportunities for people in the organization, but there's really no rhyme or reason. It's just as things come up, as opportunities present themselves, there's leadership development available. And I would tell you that for leaders in these organizations, it feels random. So, one of the things to always consider is how does the approach we have feel to those leaders who we're trying to actually develop? Another approach is what I refer to as the pain approach. So this is kind of, just what it means. It's, something has happened and there is a point of pain, and we are now going to do some leadership development to address that pain. So an example of this might be an organization or a church or whatever, where, the leaders seem to be always coming in late. They're always late to come to a meeting. They're late turning in, whatever reports or anything that they're supposed to be doing. Just everything seems to be happening late. And then suddenly the organization decides, the church decides, we need to do some time management training. So suddenly time management is an important leadership development approach. Maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not, but the point is we're addressing a pain. The organizational approach is where those who are in the highest level of the organization, they are the ones who determine the approach, and they are the ones who are designing it and kind of doing it, if you will, to everyone else. So it's kind of the top-down approach, if you will. The individual approach is really, it's the exact opposite. It is each individual in the organization is designing or creating their own leadership development. And, it often feels really good to them. However, since there's no, cohesive strategy, there's no connection to other leaders, it often feels very disconnected. And to the organization, it may or may not be fruitful. And then the strengths approach is based on the work of the Gallup organization, if you're familiar with Gallup. And it's really about, focusing on where people are already strong. The areas in the church, it might be where people are already gifted, and how do we continue to develop, those gifts. So none of these are right or wrong. I'm sharing this as, these are just some different approaches that are taken by different organizations. I would say, in my experience, many churches fall into one or more of these areas. The challenge is it's not necessarily an intentional approach, and in most cases, it's not reaching the results, the fruit that we would desire. I'm gonna pause that conversation for just a second, and I'm gonna share with you something it's a book called Gapology, and there's a lot of great information in there. It's not a church book, but it applies to our leadership development approach conversation, because the authors do a great job of identifying, what are we trying to focus on in order to close the gap. So if you think about a gap in your church, and I'll use the example of evangelism. If for some reason you think that church members, church leaders are not really sharing the good news, they're not inviting people to church, whatever your definition of evangelism might be, then that's a gap. So you've identified a gap. And the first piece of this is the knowledge gap. Do people know how to do it? Do we need to actually train people how to evangelize in this example? The second piece of that is, if they know how to do it and they're still not doing it, do they know why it's important? And this is where we would have to close the importance gap. And if they know how to do it and they know it's important and they still aren't doing it, then that's where there's a choice. And each person has a choice. Am I going to do it or not? And that's the action gap. And this is where accountability, commitment, and culture come in. And the most important, the strongest force in any church is the culture. So I share this because if you think about, your leadership development approach, how you're developing leaders in your church, it is important to realize, what gaps are we trying to close, and how do we most effectively help people to close those gaps? So a big piece of it is creating that leadership development culture. Okay, so I'm going to share with you an example of a leadership development pathway. This is in no way meant to be, this is the one way to do it or the right way or anything like that. I'm just sharing with you a big picture of the concepts and how you might begin to think about, how does this apply in your church? So it really is about creating a culture of intentionally developing leaders in your ministry. So one of the things to think about is the intersection point of three specific areas. So if you think about, what's most important to your church when it comes to leadership development, what are the areas that are most important to you? And then what's most important to the specific ministry where leaders are serving? So maybe it's trustees, maybe it's children's ministry, whatever it might be. What are most important about a leader in those areas? And then what's most important to the individual leaders? The home run, if you will, or the sweet spot is where those three areas intersect. Now, I can guarantee you're not going to hit a home run every time. But every time you do, it's a win-win-win. So when you can figure out how to develop a leader so that they feel like this is a value to me, the ministry where they're serving feels like, this is helping the leaders in our area, and the overall church feels like, hey, we're growing our leaders, that's a home run. That's what you're shooting for. Now, I do want to draw attention, if you'll notice, the individual leader circle is a little larger than the others. If you're going to focus a little more in one of the areas, that's the best area to focus on. The more you can focus, and I'm not saying exclude the other two, but if you're going to focus a little more somewhere, please do it on the individual leader. That will give you the best results. So look for that sweet spot. How can we really develop leaders in all, so that it affects and impacts positively all three areas? Okay, so the first piece is the begin, and this is really about where can leaders get in the game. For practical aspects, this is really the leadership orientation. Or in some cases, you may think about the onboarding. How do we get leaders up to speed? How do we help them understand, what does this mean to be a leader in this specific ministry area? This is a challenge in most churches. And, this is something that I think we can all do a better job in helping leaders get on board, get started. Now, I'll reference Ken Blanchard's organization one more time. There's a book that came out a long time ago called Leadership and the 1 Minute Manager. And it's all about situational leadership. And that is a game changer. If you've not read that, he also wrote a book with some of the same concepts in a book called Lead Like Jesus. But it's really about, when somebody starts a new position, they're starting at, square one. And we cannot assume that they already have the information they need to be successful. And I think we in the church have a lot of growing room in this area. How do we help new leaders get up to speed? And sometimes the best thing we can do is just cover kind of the basics, the one-on-one kind of stuff. So this is also where, as a church, as a pastor, this is a great place to share beliefs about leadership. What does leadership mean in this ministry? What does leadership mean to you? So if you think about all the different, foundational elements, and on the screen are just some examples. Again, it's not meant to be all exclusive, but leadership is a gift that can be, is both a spiritual gift and it can be learned. It flows out of discipleship, like we talked about before. Like discipleship, leaders are never done growing as a leader. And churches need servant leaders. We need leaders with the white towel over the arm who are washing feet. We don't really need leaders who are all about the power and the position. We need leaders who focus on the mission. So again, all of the things that you see on the screen, those are just examples, but this is the time for the pastor, for the church, to clearly articulate, what does leadership mean to you? The next piece is, after the begin, is the baseline. And this is where I would encourage you as a church to really, think about, what are the minimum expectations? What are the things that you wish every leader in your ministry, no matter what position they're serving, every leader in your ministry had these foundational understandings. So in some cases, churches will teach 3 or 4 classes on these areas. It's done different ways in different ministries, different size churches, but it's how do you communicate this information? How do you clearly explain this? These are the minimum levels of expectation for leaders in our church. And one of the tools that I think is helpful, or can be helpful for you in this process, is what's called competencies. So if you think about leadership competencies, these are things, these are areas where leaders have strengths. There are areas where leaders maybe need to grow in, but the competencies, these are the things that help leaders become fruitful in ministry. And it may differ from church to church, but most likely you can probably identify 2 or 3. two or three competencies that would be important for your church to focus on. And it may change season to season, but I have often found that the focusing on competencies, picking out two or three of them, gives you a nice baseline to build on. Okay, so those are the first two areas. The begin and the baseline, those are kind of the on-ramps, if you will, to the ongoing pathway. So if you think about, the pathway, never ends. People are always going to be on the leadership pathway, just like they're always on the discipleship pathway. The begin and the baseline just kind of get them into the game. So now we'll take a quick look at become, belong, and bless. And again, please understand, I'm not saying these are the words, or these are this is the way you should do it in your church. I'm just sharing this as an example. So belong is all about leadership's belonging to a community with other leaders. Leaders tend to learn best with other leaders. Leaders tend to grow best with other leaders, not necessarily leaders who are in the same position or the same role in the church, but others who are leading in ministry. And this is true, by the way, of both pastors and laity. And in my experience, the best communities have been a combination of pastors and laity. So this is a place where people can learn and grow together, and there's accountability. So that's a key piece of it. If you're familiar with the John Wesley model of society, class, and bands, the short version, society is kind of how we think about worship today. The class is similar to how we might think about small groups, maybe some Sunday schools, probably not most of them, but kind of that size usually. And then the leadership bands, Wesley actually had, kind of two main types of bands. One was bands for people in recovery. So you might think about Celebrate Recovery or some kind of recovery ministry. But he also advocated for leadership bands. And these are very small groups. These are groups with, maybe 3 or 4, probably 6 at the most people. So it's very small, and that's intentional so that people really have time to get to know each other and to grow together as leaders. So it's just something to think about in your ministry. What would it look like for the leaders in our ministry to be doing something in a community together, some kind of leadership group? The next one is becoming leaders like Jesus. The emphasis here is on growing as a disciple first. Leaders tend to be readers, and maybe that's reading an old traditional kind of paper book. Maybe it's an ebook. Maybe it's listening to an audio book. Maybe it's some other form of learning. But leaders tend to be people who like to continue to learn and grow. And that's something we in the church need to encourage. I always encourage leaders to go where leadership is taught. Now, in my experience, leadership is taught all over the place. It may not always be called leadership training, and it most likely is not taking place in a church building. But in my experience, libraries, community colleges, business organizations, all kinds of places and communities are doing leadership training, and in many cases, it's open to anybody. And I always encourage church leaders to go and to expand, learn about leadership somewhere else, because chances are you'll pick up something that will help you in ministry. And then another way for leaders to become more like Jesus, to really grow in this leadership area, is to learn more about themselves. And there's lots of great tools Examples of this would be things like Myers-Briggs, or I mentioned Gallup or earlier, the Gallup Strength Finders. Um, Gosh, I'm blanking out. DISC profile is another one. There's so many different ones out there. Now, I do encourage leaders always don't just take the survey. Take the survey, take the information, find out about yourself, but also spend some time having conversation with a coach or at least with another leader to talk about, so what? What does this mean? What is it telling me? How do I use this information? So, DISC, Myers-Briggs, Gallup, whatever it might be, those are all great, but please don't only just take that survey. Please find a way to use that and to have some discussion about it. As I mentioned before, leaders need to grow as disciples first. I always think about, as far as a laity, a member of the church, when you think about the membership vows in our church, those are great. That's a great model for how we need to grow as a disciple. How are we growing in our prayers, presence, gifts, service, and witness? How does this year look different than last year? As leaders in ministry, we are called to set the example. So for us to help others to grow as disciples, we need to be growing ourselves. And then finally, blessing others through our leadership. Leadership is one of those gifts, like all gifts, really, but leadership is not a gift given just for us to keep it to ourselves. Leadership is a gift that we must use in the kingdom. And so, people need to be blessing others with that gift of leadership. So for us as leaders, it's about leading something. And I know from time to time, from season to season, a leader may need to take some time off. Oops, sorry. But it really is about getting back in the game, and how do we as leaders continue to bless others with our leadership gift. So that's an example of a leadership pathway. What it looks like in your ministry may look totally different. I'm just sharing some areas really for you to think about, how do those areas fit into your ministry? So I do want to pause for a second, and I want to mention the Book of Discipline 258.1. That paragraph talks about the Committee on Nominations and Leadership Development. And this may not be true in your church, but it's true in 99% of the churches that I've ever worked with all over the country. In most cases, that committee only focuses on nominations. They only focus on filling the slots for the upcoming charge conference, and they only meet a few times a year. Usually it's right around this time. It's August, September, October kind of thing. And then that's it. And I encourage you to really take a hard look at that paragraph, and to think about what would it look like in your church to really refocus that team on year-round leadership development. So rather than creating a whole new team to focus on leadership development in your church, would it be possible for you to tweak and to make it a little more intentional for this team, what we usually refer to only as the nominations team, but to really get back to the purpose of it, to be a nominations and leadership development team? I think that's a great opportunity for all of us. So last couple of things, these are some areas that we cover again in detail in the book. We talk about covenants, how important it is for leaderships to have a leadership covenant as for how they will operate as a team of leaders. We talk about the concept of coaching, how important that is, not necessarily for leaders to be coaches, but for leaders to have in their toolbox coaching skills. As a professionally certified coach, I always encourage leaders who feel called to become a coach. I encourage them to pursue that. I would also say 90+% of leaders in churches will probably never become a coach. I do think 100% of leaders in churches can have the coaching skills in their toolbox. And I think that will help them be better leaders. And then again, I know I mentioned this earlier, but the culture of the church, we often don't realize we're creating a culture until we look into the rearview mirror. And this season may be a season for you to begin to create an intentional leadership development culture in your church. It won't happen overnight, but it can begin with the steps that you're about to put into place. One of the things that I have found helpful in conversations with leaders is it's what's referred to as a coaching wheel. And this, again, what's on the screen is, and in your workbook, is just an example. It's not meant to be the only way to do this. But if you have, some kind of illustration, some kind of diagram that you can show different areas of leadership, and you can have this is intended to be a one-on-one conversation with someone. Where do they feel in this season of their leadership strongest? And maybe where do they feel, not as strong? So it's a self-reflection exercise. And then it's a matter of having that conversation about where would you like to grow? And it should not be limited to only where they feel a lower level. It can be any area. Maybe it's where they feel the strongest. But it's like discipleship. It's helping the leader identify for themselves where they want to grow as a leader. So it's a tool I share with you. Again, we cover it a little deeper in the book, but I have found it to be very helpful in one-on-one leadership conversations. Mentoring is different than coaching. So mentoring is someone who has done it before, someone who's maybe in that position now, and they are helping someone newer to grow into that position. And I think mentoring is a lost art in the church. I think it's something that can really help leaders of all types in our churches to get up to speed. There are different mentoring techniques in the book and on the screen. We share, just one of the ways that it can be helpful. But if you think about a leadership position that you're about to have turnover in your church, having someone who is about to step out of that position, mentor someone who is stepping in, can be a great way to get them up to speed. So I encourage you to really explore, mentoring and coaching are very different, but I think they both have a place in our churches. And then small church leadership. So churches are different. I mentioned that earlier, and it's not, it's like trying to compare two different ecologies. You can't compare the ocean to the desert and say one is healthy and one is not. The same thing with churches. You can't compare one size church or one type of church to another and say one is healthy and one is not. In small church leadership, which, by the way, most of the churches in conference where I serve now in West Virginia are very small. Our average size is 12 to 34. So small church leadership is really all about how do I take these concepts and focus on, what really applies here and find one step. So I think too often what happens in the church world is we read a book or we go to a workshop or something, we hear some great stuff and we try to apply it all. And I think really what we're called to as leaders is how do we find that one thing, that one next step, and just take that. and just, when I take that step, then I'll take another. But focus not on the whole thing, but focus on just what's that one next step. I think, when you think about the example that I shared for the whole leadership pathway, maybe it's just focusing on the begin. Maybe it's just focusing on how do I help leaders get up to speed? How do I help improve the onboarding process? And I would say that's a victory. That's a win. In your workbook, and one of the things we talk about is getting beyond just filling the slots. And part of that is what's known as kind of the leadership pipeline, or how do we think about leadership in a longer term perspective. In most of our churches, we're so focused on reacting. We have a leadership opening we have to fill, so we try to focus. We can only focus on filling that opening or those openings. And in this process, in this concept, what we're encouraging is to intentionally grow beyond just being reactive, and to really begin to think forward. So next year, who might be rolling off, and how do we prepare somebody to fill the position that's not even open yet? How do we create this system of identifying, developing, and preparing leaders within? And that is hard work, and it's also something that helps produce more fruit for the kingdom. It gets us beyond just trying to put out fires, but it really gets us to help us to be proactive. As Bill mentioned earlier, so I do have several different books. I hope this has been helpful for you tonight. I hope there's been something that you've been able to pick up. Church Ecology is available, as you can see, just about anywhere, if that's a helpful resource to you. If you're interested in getting a copy from me, the website, Ken Willard, pcc.square at site. It's where you can get an autographed copy of any of the books, if you're interested in that. But I hope that this short webinar tonight has sparked some interest and created some ideas for you about next steps. So with that, I am going to stop the share. And
Ken,
Bill,
put that share back up for a second. Go back to the books for a second, please. Before I even met Ken Willard, let's see. Go back one. I started with Time Management for the Christian Leader, great book. Strategy Matters, great book. Stride, great book. So I've got 3 left. I'm four through or 3 through your trilogy. But I highly recommend picking up any of Ken's books if you want to know more about discipleship and service in the church. I've put Ken's website in the chat. You can stop the share. I wanted to just say, particularly what I appreciate about Ken is, and I can't undervalue this enough, Ken is a layperson and approaches this from the perspective and the ministry of lay people that clergy just sometimes forget. And I appreciate that lens through which you view and train and lead, because you really are about equipping the saints for the work of ministry. And I thank God for you, Ken, and that which you bring to the West Virginia Annual Conference, and definitely to the Northeast jurisdiction, as well as our entire network of congregational developers across the country. We do have a question that has come into the Q&A, and then I want to give an example. Somebody has asked, can you recommend a resource for coaching services as a leader? So if somebody's looking for a coach, um, I know in the Baltimore-Washington conference for clergy, um, you would reach out to your district superintendent. But for lay people, where would they go to look for a coach?
Yeah, so I would recommend anybody who's coaching a pastor, who's a professional coach, uh, can and should coach a layperson. And so, coaching is different than mentoring. And the example I would give is, so as a professional coach, 90+% of my clients for the past 15 years have been pastors. And I've never been a pastor. So I can't mentor a pastor. I can't tell a pastor, here's what I would do or here's what I'm doing as a pastor, but I can coach a pastor. So I would say the same is true for anybody who's a professional coach who is coaching a pastor, can and should coach a layperson. So if you go to the International Coaching Federation website, you'll be able to find professional coaches. If you want to find a credentialed coach, that's a good place to go. Coaching for Clergy also has a sister website, Coaching for Business Leaders, and in both of those areas you can find recommended professional coaches. But as Bill said, usually the conference, the district, often has a list of some coaches that they're using.
And you can reach out to me. I'm also a certified coach, and we can share with you some of the other coaches that that we use. When you were talking about filling slots, you drew me back to my very first appointment, Ken, 32 years ago. Here's what not to do, friends. We sat in the kitchen of the basement of the church with the church directory in front of us and flipped through and landed on who should serve. And then the patriarch of the church would go through, he wasn't on the committee, they would just hand him the list and he would go through and decide if somebody had been at the church long enough. And long enough meant more than 20 years that they could serve. That is not the way to do it. So if you're looking for a model, don't do that. Listen to Ken and do what, WWKD, what would Ken do? Because I know he's also asking Jesus and kind of get some good answers for that. I was derelict in some of my duties. I forgot to say thank you to our conference lay leader, Ken. She has attended every single
Wow.
podcast of Training Tuesday, and this is our 5th season.
Wow.
You are like episode 3 of our 5th season, and so
wow. That's great. I think with the using the directory. I mean, I've been in those meetings. I'm as guilty as anybody, and I think part of it is how do we do so when we feel the crush of time, we've got to have these positions filled. We've got to, whatever. I mean, how do we do both? Okay, maybe we have to do something right now, but how do we position ourselves so that we don't find ourselves back in this again a year from now? And I think that's the learning we all need is, how do we get ahead of this?
I wanted to give people a highlight. Our next Training Tuesday will be on Tuesday, November 7th. You can find information at our conference affiliation website. That address is, I'm going to put it in the chat, but it's pdcbwc.org. And you can just click on the Training Tuesday link and find out more information about upcoming Training Tuesdays. But our next one is on November 7th. and it is dealing with conference trustees. I'm just trying to pull up the title. It's called Aligning Money and Mission. And we're looking at, with a group called Rooted Good, how to be good stewards of the building and property, and how we might be able to use our assets in different ways in order to leverage ministry. And then following that, on November 14th, Paul Eichelberger and our finance team will be leading a webinar on budgeting as a response to vision, and how to create a budget. It's going to explore assembling that whole project timeline and a budget for that. And we'll close out our 5th season on November 28th with training for our church councils towards a better meeting, crafting meaningful discussions, decisions, and change. And so all of that information is at our affiliation website. And we hope, if you don't sign up, friends, that you tell the trustees or finance people or church council people from your congregation to sign up. So once again, Ken, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate you taking the time. I
Absolutely.
hope you travel safely back to your family room from your home office, and enjoy an evening of relaxation. For everyone who has been with us tonight, we are so grateful and thank you, and have a blessed evening, everyone. And we'll see you on the next Training Tuesday, November 7th. Good night.